Today, we're going to hear from Sovaida Ewing, remarkable Baha'i in Washington, D.C., born and raised, well, not raised, but born in Kenya, if I recall correctly, or where her mother was a pioneer, mother and father. She is an international lawyer and independent scholar, and the founding director of the Center for Peace and Global Governance. You can see the web link here on your screen. It's a virtual think tank and online forum that pools and proposes principled solutions to pressing global problems. And she just published a new book that CPGG published. The book is titled Bridge to Global Governance, Tackling Climate Change, Energy Distribution, and Nuclear Proliferation. And this particular book posits that the best solution for the world's problems is to take the sort of approach that the Europeans have been taking since World War II of gradually building up international institutions, pooling sovereignty in steps as people become more and more trustful of each other and as these institutions become more effective at collective governance. So that's the theme of that particular book, and I think that theme presumably relates in some ways to her presentation today, Finding Hope in Troubled Times, because after all, one of the main ways we can find hope is to look at the positive things going on around us, such as the situation with building the European Union. So at this point, I will turn it over to Sovaida. Sovaida, welcome to our web talk, your second one, I believe you've done for us, and We're very grateful for your presentation today.
All right, welcome everybody to this conversation today about finding hope in turbulent times. As the topic indicates, my goal in sharing a few thoughts with you is to really galvanize us and get us out of the state of hopelessness and despondency into which we have sunk because of what we see is going on in the world. And I hope that by the end of our conversation together, you're going to feel more energetic and motivated to go out and do something to help change the world for better. Well, I'm not going to dwell much on the current state of the world. It is obvious when we turn on the news that we live in very turbulent times. Some of the interesting new phenomena we see is in the social arena, the Me Too movement, and the focus on the proliferation of sexual assaults on both women and men. 1 in every 3 in the United States women and 1 in every 7 men will be sexually assaulted, which is a horrific statistic. I remember years ago hearing that in Peru, 95% of the population experienced sexual assault. This was the women of that country, and at the time I thought it was pretty horrendous, but we all seem to be moving in that same direction. The problem of migration has caused a lot of problems around the world and has caused communities to be more balkanized and to hunker down and isolate themselves, and has led to the growth of populist movements who are very xenophobic and nationalistic in their outlooks. We see growing distrust in all kinds of institutions, be it the Catholic Church with all the scandals that it is facing that have to do with pedophilia within the ranks of the priesthood, or whether it's the Human Rights Council of the United Nations that continues to have as its members countries that are egregious human rights violators, or whether it's the United Nations that seems to be incapable still of solving some critical challenges such as genocide, as we have seen in Syria, such as nuclear proliferation, as we've seen in North Korea and continue to see, and in Iran, and climate change. More than anything, it is the single problem that most thinkers of our time say is able to completely destroy us. So you'll see on this slide that there are many areas in which we see upheaval, including economic, environmental, and so on. I'm not going to spend any more time on those. Now, it's perfectly understandable that all of these problems lead to despondency and apathy. What's actually happened when we analyze the situation is that we have sunk into negative mindsets, both as individuals and as collective societies. What happens in this negative mindset is that we suffer from two negative thoughts that are really the primary thoughts that motivate us. The first is a thought of I'm a victim, victimhood, which by definition leads to a feeling of helplessness, which in turn translates into non-action, apathy essentially. And at such a critical time in the fortunes of humanity, it is the one thing that we can ill afford, which is to be paralyzed in our actions. The second thought that is uppermost in the minds of many, and all we have to do is go out on the streets and experience road rage and frustration and anger, is anger. It's a dominant mode of being and thinking, and it leads to conflict, which is plentiful in the world, and a sense of defiance, and also a sense of entitlement, that life and the world owe me because of who I am, whatever that means, either because I've been victimized, or my people have been victimized, or because my people should be the ones in power and we're the entitled ones. So this business of entitlement, interestingly, now runs the gamut and applies to, it seems, almost everybody for different reasons. The problem with both of these mindsets and energies is that they're self-destructive and self-defeating. So we need to do what we can to shift away from these mindsets. And this is why we're having this conversation. So there is hope. What if someone were to tell us that all of what we see going on in the world is actually part of a greater plan? How might our reaction to it change? Indeed, there is a beautiful quotation from The Guardian, which you will see up on your screens, in which he says that the chaos that we see is but an aspect of a greater plan whose, sorry, I'm trying to see my screen properly here. Okay. All right. Whose source is God, whose author is Baha'u'llah, the theater of whose operations is the entire planet, and whose ultimate objectives are the unity of the human race. But this concept of a greater plan is definitely there. Now, speaking particularly to those of us who are in the United States, I found a very interesting comment from Shori Effendi in the writings that should give us some heart, given everything that we've been experiencing, especially over the last couple of years. He says that the woes and tribulations which threaten the American nation are partly avoidable, and these are the words highlighted in red, but mostly inevitable and God-sent. Now, the reason that should give us heart is, rather than feeling that our lives are out of control, that somehow we've fallen off the path, that what's happening doesn't fit in with the purpose that we thought the United States had, far from that, The Guardian tells us that these woes are mostly inevitable and God-sent. And then he goes on to tell us why. He says, because both our government and our people, so both are responsible, right? We elect those who are in power. So the people are responsible, really, along with the government. We're clinging tenaciously to obsolescent doctrines of absolute sovereignty. And the second thing we're doing is upholding a political system that is manifestly at variance with the needs of a world that is already contracted into a neighborhood and crying out for unity. So the reason why we have these woes and tribulations is so that we can be purged, again, you see this on your screen, purged of our anachronistic conceptions and prepared to play a preponderating role in hoisting the standard of the lesser peace, in the unification of humanity, and the establishment of a world federal government on this planet. So this should give us a lot of hope. In other words, in some sense, we're exactly where we're meant to be, because we have to go through a process of purification and preparation so that we can fulfill our tremendous destiny. In sum, therefore, we conclude that what we witness in the world is the direct result of the release of creative spiritual energies brought with the revelation of Baha'u'llah, sent as a token of God's immense love for us. That seems like a pretty odd thing to say, but there you have it. This is based on the writings of Baha'u'llah and of the faith. So here's a quotation from Shoghi Effendi in which he describes the energies that have been released. They have triggered two processes that are simultaneous. And in your quotation, you'll see he talks about a twofold process that is transforming the face of the planet. The first is essentially an integrating process, while the second is fundamentally a destructive one. Now, these energies, we're also told by the writings, that have affected the entire world. So whether people are Baha'is or not, they're affected by these energies and these dual processes. The only difference is that the Baha'is know what their source is and what the ultimate outcome is going to be. Now, what if we were to understand that the disintegration that we see holds within it as many, if not more, opportunities for us than the processes of integration, and that the opportunities inherent in the disintegration are extremely valuable? Here are the ways, again, based on the writings, in which the disintegration that we're witnessing is extremely valuable. First of all, it releases the potentialities inherent in the station of man. It also reveals the full measure of man's, humanity's destiny on earth and the innate excellence of our reality. Third, it tends to tear down the antiquated barriers that seek to block our progress towards our destined goal. It is also described in the writings as similar to labor pains, proclaiming the death pangs of the old order on the one hand and the birth pangs of a new world order. And we have this quotation from Baha'u'llah in which he says that the whole earth is now in a state of pregnancy, and the day is approaching when it will have yielded its noblest fruits. The last thing that I found in the writings that again struck me very forcefully was that the Guardian says that the suffering that we're going through and the chaos will lead us to the point that it will instill the sense of responsibility that is needed in our leaders to do the right thing in order to get us to the next stage in our collective evolution. Now, for the Baha'is, the Guardian tells us that we must take full advantage of these opportunities, the opportunities brought about by the disintegration. He says the disintegration offers undreamt of opportunities. And here, by the way, he's addressing the American believers. And he says we must fully and courageously arise to exploit them. So this is, again, to me is a rallying cry and a very positive infusion of energy into us. We have our marching orders and know what we need to do. Now, we've described the two processes of integration and disintegration. Between this integrative process and the disintegrative one lies a third path that really represents the forces that are in harmony with the spirit of the age, with the spirit of the oneness of humanity, the spirit that Baha'u'llah's coming has infused into the planet. And this third process is the one that will lead us to the lesser peace. Indeed, Baha'u'llah told the kings and rulers of the world that now that they had refused the most great peace, again, you see this quotation on your screen, they were to hold on to the lesser peace so that perhaps they could, in some degree, ameliorate their own conditions and those of their dependents. So for now, the first step for us is to work towards the lesser peace. So the question is, what is the lesser peace? How do we describe and define it so that we will recognize it when we arrive, and more importantly, so that we know what we need to work towards? The first point in the writings, again, you'll see this on your screen, is that it involves the political unification of the Eastern and Western hemispheres. So this is something that the nations of the world, the leaders of the world will bring about. It is not something that the Baha'is are going to have that big a hand in, although, as I will get to later, we can participate in creating a fertile soil so that we will elect the kinds of leaders who will come to this political unification a little faster than we seem to be right now with our move towards nationalism and xenophobia. We seem to have taken a step backwards. The second thing that describes the lesser peace, according to The Guardian, is the emergence of a world government. I wanted to highlight this because I often hear Baha'is say, oh, why are you working on global governance? World government will only come much later in the history of the world, when many people have already embraced the faith. And that is just not true based on the writings. The Guardian specifically says the emergence of a world government is one of the features of the lesser peace. Later in the Most Great Peace, we will have a Baha'i world commonwealth and a continual building on this idea of world government and world federation. Other writings of The Guardian give us some other features that are listed on your slide. They include a call to limiting arms. This will be a feature of the lesser peace. A meeting of some of the leaders of the world, the assemblage of leaders who will gather with the sole aim of establishing peace. Recognition of the need for consultation among nations, and the implementation of the principle of collective security, which, by the way, again, you cannot do if you do not have a world government that can actually enforce the principle of collective security, because otherwise it's just words, and we already have those words enshrined in the United Nations Charter to a certain extent. Okay. Now, I wanted us to focus very briefly on this wonderful passage from the House of Justice, in case we were still unconvinced about what the lesser peace stands for and what its features are. The House says that this process, and it is a process, it is not an event, but a process, will be gradual. That's the first thing. Will involve many stages and will no doubt witness tests and setbacks, as well as great advances. So again, we shouldn't be disheartened if we find ourselves in a period right now in which we're experiencing what appear to be setbacks. It will, however, the House of Justice promises, include a development of major historic importance, that point at which the majority, and again, here we go again, part of the feature of the lesser peace, the majority of the world's nation states will formally, not informally, commit themselves to a global order comprising both institutions and laws, and equipped with the means by which collective decisions can be enforced. Again, when you read the writings of The Guardian, this means a world government. And then they say, although we can't foresee the precise form this development will take, much less the point at which it will occur, it is a feature of the process of the lesser peace. And this is in a letter written by the House of Justice to an individual in April 2001. Now, what can we do as Baha'is and as individuals, whether Baha'i or not, to hasten the lesser peace? It will come, but the question is, how quickly will it come? This was something that the Universal House of Justice addressed in the Peace Statement in 1985. The first thing we need to do is to change our perception of reality from a negative one to a positive one. We do this by changing our limiting beliefs and our interpretations of reality that are extremely negative and are holding us back from fulfilling our collective and our individual potentials. So let's give an example of the way in which we can change a limiting belief. When we look at the state of the world, we tend to say to ourselves, oh gosh, well, human beings are just bad by nature, evil by nature. And besides, if you look at our history, we've always been subject to conflict and war, and that's never going to change. So there's some false assumptions built into this way of thinking, as well as some limiting beliefs. And the writings spin this completely differently. They say, no, in fact, we need to view our journey as a humanity, as a collective whole, our journey from infanthood to maturity. And that we've been going through stages in which we're widening the circles of societal unity, starting with the family, to the tribe, to the city-state, to the nation, and that the next inevitable stage is for us to achieve the unification of humanity. And here we have a quotation from The Guardian in which he very pithily summarizes this and says that we are now in the adolescent stage of humanity, and that we're going through a very slow, so again, slow, it's not going to come about quickly, and painful evolution. Another way in which we can change our perception of humanity is to recognize that we have become like a single organism. We have become one body. What's fascinating to me is to see that many of the current thinkers of our time and politicians are coming to the recognition that humanity, thanks to globalization, you know, the spread of communications and trade and so on, has become one, a single body. And that because of the interconnectedness and interdependence, the unprecedented nature of those that we see today, we have become an organism that, while benefiting in many ways, has also become prone to suffering from systemic problems and systemic diseases. And this is exactly what Baha'u'llah talks about in this quotation that you see on your screen. So the way to view this is that these diseases are in fact telling us what we need to do. They're telling us that what we need are, first of all, institutions, new institutions of global governance, new collective decision-making and enforcement institutions that include a world parliament, a world executive, a permanent standing force, and an international tribunal, because all of these are absolutely essential if we are to assure the peace of the world, if we're to create peace and maintain it over the long term. The second thing that these challenges and systemic crises tell us is that we have a need for global ethics. We need to identify a set of organizing principles that can both underpin and be woven into the very fabric of these new institutions of global governance. The Universal House of Justice identified this as a first step to take in the peace statement, when they said that leaders of government and those in authority would be well served if they would first seek to identify the principles involved and then be guided by them. There's a beautiful analogy given by one of the great thinkers of our time. He says that until now, humanity has been like 193 small boats bobbing on the oceans of life, if you like. He said, we've now become 193 cabins of a ship. He says, unfortunately, each cabin is being administered beautifully, but the ship as a whole lacks a captain and lacks crew members. So if a tremendous storm were to hit the ship, it is likely to sink. And so it's time, he says, to create a system of global governance that will ensure that this ship of humanity can be brought to port safely. I find that an absolutely beautiful and very wise analogy. The third thing that we need to understand as we shift our perception to the positive is that we as global society are in the throes of collective tests that are designed to purify us and prepare us for our glorious destiny. The calamities that we're witnessing are not random, the writings tell us, but rather they're blessings in disguise. There is this wonderful quotation again from Shoghi Effendi in Promised Days Come, in which he talks about these calamities and the chaos we're witnessing as being both a retributory calamity and an act of holy and supreme discipline. That it's a cleansing process, that it's designed to purge us and prepare us for our future mission. Because God, on the one hand, is not going to let us escape the responsibilities of the past, but he's also not going to let us shirk the responsibilities of the future. So really the act of a loving parent. The next way in which we can change our perception is to understand the role of suffering, because that is what's happening in the world right now. Many peoples are suffering immensely. And this is not to diminish from their suffering, but to understand why we in the world are suffering. The first thing the writings tell us is that these fires, these ordeals will implant in our leaders the sense of responsibility that they need to arise and do what's necessary. This quotation from Shoghi Effendi in World Order is really quite a grabbing quotation. And as far as I'm concerned, we're not there yet, obviously, because we don't seem to have the kinds of leaders we need yet. The second way to look at suffering is that it is like labor pains, and we discussed this before, so I won't dwell on it, but I wanted to remind us of the role of suffering. And the third way the writings describe the role of suffering is as welding, serving to weld the components of a disparate international community into one indivisible, organic, world-embracing community. So it's the heat of these sufferings is going to bring us together. Now, there is one other thing that the writings talk about, which again, I find fascinating and wanted to put up on the screen. Suffering, the writings tell us, will ultimately precipitate a radical change in our very conception of society. However, we're going to have to go through several stages to get there. First, according to The Guardian, we will have adversity allied to chaos and universal destruction, which will in turn stir the conscience of the people of the world, will disillusion the masses, and we're starting to see disillusionment, and then eventually precipitate a radical change in the very conception of society, which is really what we need to get us to the next stage, which is the coalescing of the disjointed and the bleeding limbs of society into one single body. This is a very interesting series of stages that The Guardian lays out for us. Abdu'l-Baha says that suffering also prepares the soil of human existence for a new stage in its growth. In his book, Divine Philosophy, he says that when wars, cataclysms, famines, and labor troubles are over, they will have done their work of equalization. I wanted to highlight this concept. You know, with this latest report released by the panel on climate change, the UN panel, they keep making it clear that all of us, no matter where we live, are going to suffer enormously just as a result of this one global challenge, climate change. And we're already starting to see evidences of it with the increasing hurricanes and floods and earthquakes and so on and so forth, and the rising waters that are drowning nation states and coastlines, and diminishing access to fresh water and fresh food, and will eventually lead to conflict as the amount of land that we have to live on will be diminished with a population that is growing so rapidly. So all of these challenges will equalize us and will then prepare that soil to allow us all to take that next step towards deeper integration and unity. And the last thing that the writings seem to say on this topic that I could find is that universal suffering is a prerequisite for universal spiritual awareness. Again, a very interesting concept. Indeed, there is apparently a tablet from Abdu'l-Baha that's referred to by Mr. Nakhjavani in his book, Towards World Order, in which Abdu'l-Baha says that the line of disintegration will propel the world towards godlessness, and it will eventually sink to such a point that it will lead to universal chaos and confusion, which will be a chaotic condition that the world will decide then that it's unwilling to bear, and only then will it turn to religion and see the importance of turning toward God. So again, suffering will be the prerequisite for universal spiritual awareness. That again, I find very interesting. Another perception that we need to change is our perception of failure and its role in our lives, both individual and collective. Failure should be viewed as an opportunity to grow, as a stepping stone, as the Guardian says, with respect to individuals, as opposed to a stumbling block. And there's a lot of very interesting work being done right now in the field of neuroscience coming out of Harvard University that says that we need to train ourselves, both as individuals and as collective wholes, to use a failure as a way to propel ourselves. That's the word that's used, propel in a new direction, to catapult ourselves into a new direction that we haven't tried yet. And the studies say that's what's interesting about human nature is that what we tend to do when we fail, either as individuals or as communities, is that we tend to either do more of the same thing that led to the failure in the first place, or we tend to take several steps back, in other words, to undo some of the progress that we've made. We see this in spades with the process of with what's going on with Brexit in the European Union. Once Britain said that she wanted to leave the European Union, we saw the reaction of other European member states. Some wanted to do the same, others said, well, we need to pull back some of the strides that we've made in terms of integration and go back more towards finding an equilibrium between nation states in the European Union rather than a fusion of interests, which was the goal of the European Union to begin with. And what this neuroscience group is calling for is to take situations like that and say, okay, what we need to do is to actually deepen our integration in Europe and take a step further towards unity, as opposed to either doing more of the same or taking a few steps back. Now, there is one kind of failure that we as Baha'is should fear, and it's the only kind. And here is the quotation from the Guardian. He says, the Baha'is should not fear the future, but rather fear any failure on their part to carry out the work of the cause. Again, these are the opportunities that the Guardian had mentioned in the previous quote that are undreamt of, that we need to arise and courageously seize and take advantage of. And he continues to say that what we see going on in the world should offer us immense hope and courage, the complete opposite of feeling despondent and apathetic. He says the act of visitation meaning punishment, should evoke in us a sense of immense hope and courage. Why? Because it creates an opportunity. So essentially, instead of seeing, once we change our perception of reality, what will happen is that instead of seeing problems everywhere, we will start to see opportunities everywhere. And that requires harnessing an incredible gift that we've been given as a human race, the gift of free will, to take opportunities and to do something constructive with them. There's this wonderful quotation from Abdu'l-Baha from Divine Philosophy, in which he points to the fact that when humanity goes through afflictions, we tend to center on limitations, what we can't do, why things are not possible. And he calls it a veritable prison. He says the only way to release ourselves is by making of the will a door through which the confirmations of the Spirit come. So this highlights the importance of the gift of free will. We also know from the writings that we've each been born with a preordained measure, but the only way to actualize that preordained measure of capacity is the exercise of volition. To me, this is starkly and amply demonstrated when I look at the story of two great historical figures, Nelson and Winnie Mandela. They each exercised their free will to choose different reactions to similar circumstances. So they were both exposed to tremendous injustice in an apartheid regime. But while Nelson Mandela chose to view his white oppressors as human beings rather than as white oppressors, and chose to react to that oppression by forgiving them, and beyond that, chose to take the positive action of extending a hand and saying, let us work together to build a better nation and community. Unfortunately, his wife, Winnie, made different choices. She continued to see the white oppressor as exactly that, the oppressor. She chose to hate that oppressor as opposed to forgive them. And the actions that she chose to undertake were those of violence. And she even instituted, as you'll recall, this business of putting tires around people's necks and filling them with gasoline and lighting them on fire for those who she deemed betrayed the cause of freeing themselves of apartheid. So that is just really to highlight that no matter what the situation, we always have the freedom to choose our reactions. The famous psychologist Viktor Frankl said that this choice, free will choice, is a spiritual freedom. That's an interesting phrase he used, and is a reflection of our independence of mind. And he was talking about the exercise of this freedom in one of the worst possible situations imaginable, the concentration camp during the Second World War, where he said he could see people faced with exactly the same horrific circumstances, yet still had the ability to choose different reactions that either showed their incredible humanity or that showed the more animalistic side of them. So the question then becomes, what can we do with our free will? What are the constructive ways in which we can exercise our free will? The first way is to work on building a just world. The writings tell us that justice is the only basis and the permanent foundation of Baha'u'llah's most great peace. And that the purpose of justice is the appearance of unity among men, and we know that the unification of humanity is the ultimate purpose and goal of the coming of Baha'u'llah. The second way in which we can exercise our free will is to ensure that women can fully participate in all levels of society. Now, these are things, again, all of us as individuals, including Baha'is and non-Baha'is, can do. Even if we can't bring about the lesser peace, we can prepare the soil by actively engaging in bringing about some of these realities. The Baha'i writings, especially Abdul Baha, tell us that woman will be, and you'll notice I've put in bold the will be the greatest factor, not maybe, possibly, no, will be the greatest factor in establishing universal peace and international arbitration. Assuredly, woman will abolish warfare, and we know that the lesser peace includes a political unification where there will no longer be war. So if we want that, we need to ensure that women make strides and get involved in all spheres of human activity at the highest levels. And war will cease when women participate fully and equally in the affairs of the world and enter confidently and capably the great arena of laws and politics, which really entails also ensuring that women have equal opportunities to education so that they can capably and confidently enter these arenas. Now, I want to turn our attention to a very important sphere of activities that all of us can engage in, and again, preparing the soil for the lesser peace. And that is to use our free will to replace old habits with new constructive ones. I'm sure all of you are very familiar with this famous statement of Shohi Effendi's, in which he says that basically our institutions and laws and habits and ideals are there to serve our interests and to serve the happiness of humanity, and not for us to sacrifice ourselves to preserve them. And that if they no longer serve them, we should have no qualms about relegating them to the limbo of obsolescent and forgotten doctrines. So this is where we begin. Interestingly, the famous historian, 20th century historian Arnold Toynbee also said that we just have, as a global community, a series of bad habits, which we will, he predicted, change, but only when we're faced with the possibility of extinction in the atomic age. He predicted that we would change these habits in the 11th hour, that we would do it kicking and screaming, and that at that point we would do the minimum necessary to bring about a global government, which I find fascinating. Again, it completely dovetails with the ideas that we have in the Baha'i writings. So what are some of the examples of habits that no longer serve us? Well, I'll start with one that's not on the list anymore, and that is the burning of fossil fuels that's exacerbating climate change. I mean, here we are barreling towards self-destruction, and yet we insist on continuing to use fossil fuels as the main source of fulfilling our energy needs. So again, this is something each of us can work on at home. Pay attention to how much energy we use and what kinds of energy. The second thing is isolationism. Human beings have a tendency, when we are feeling badly about ourselves or feeling threatened, to hunker down and isolate ourselves and fragment. And all the science at the moment shows that the best thing to do in situations of fear or pressure or stress is the opposite, is to build social relationships and to enter into cooperation with others. Again, it's wonderful to see science and religion coming together like this. So we need to change this natural habit and inclination we have. And once we're mindful of it, we can change it, because the fragmentation is not serving us, and we see it all around the world. We see it with the desire of so many peoples to secede from larger communities or nations because they think somehow that they can control their own destinies better. But that is just an illusion, because we are already that single organism. We're an interconnected body, and the liver can no longer say to the lungs, I don't care about you, I'm just going to pay attention to me, and so on. So these are systemic problems to which we need collective solutions based on consultation and cooperation. The second habit that no longer serves us is the habit of nationalism, where we only consider national self-interest. And this is something we see on the rise, you know, my nation first, even if it's at the expense of other nations. So we seem to have taken one step back. But again, the Guardian told us to expect setbacks on the road to the lesser peace. So we shouldn't be disheartened, but we do take note. The analogy that I gave you of the ship illustrates this really well. The person who gave the analogy said that another fascinating aspect is that each of the cabins has its own rules, but sometimes the internal rules of the cabins are such that they are a danger to the entire ship and can scuttle it. And this is exactly what we're seeing again with the moves towards xenophobia and nationalism. The third habit is that of expediency, which means that we react to problems with short-term thinking and by taking very narrow local and national self-interest into account, as opposed to proactive long-term thinking and taking into account the good of the global community that has now become the single organism. What we need to do is replace expediency with a principled approach. And the House of Justice, again, talked about this in the peace statement, that we need to identify a set of principles that are organizing principles and apply them really methodically in solving the problems of the world. And as The Guardian says, one of the key principles we need to operationalize, which is, I love that word, is the principle of the oneness of humanity, which is the pivot around which all the teachings of Baha'u'llah revolved. And he says it's the failure to operationalize this principle of oneness that has led to all the problems we have, because it demonstrates that our leaders have failed to read or write the signs of the time and reshape the machinery of their governments in accordance with this standard of oneness. He also says, and I think this is really important for us to remember, that this principle of oneness concerns itself primarily, these are his words, primarily with the nature of the essential relationships binding states. That's fascinating. It doesn't concern itself primarily with our individual relationships, but with these relationships between institutions and states. Another key principle is that of subordinating national impulses to the needs of a global community and applying principles of federalism versus nationalism. Now, these are some of the habits that no longer serve us that we need to change. Another way in which, another area in which we need to harness our free will to change the way we do business, if you like, in the international arena is, and also locally and nationally, is to change our relationship to authority. At the moment, we tend to view authority as an instrument for dominance, and it's no wonder that we react negatively towards it. Instead, we could spin that again and change our perception to view authority as a necessary element in social organization, the role of which is to create conditions that allow each of us, both as individuals and as a global society, to fulfill our individual and collective potential. Another area in which we need to harness our free will to change the way we do things is the way we elect our leaders. Instead of focusing on what they say and on the promises they make and on all the information that we receive from unreliable sources, we need to look at their behaviors, examine their motivations, look at their qualities. Are they honest? Are they upright? Are they free from corruption, both in their business dealings and in the way they treat their families? Are they cheating on their husbands or wives? How are they treating their children? And we also need to look at record of service. This is not something that we've been accustomed to doing. And it actually entails honing within ourselves a new skill, which is the independent investigation of truth, which, as we know, is one of the foundational tenets of the Baha'i faith. But it doesn't just apply to the area of finding the word of God for today and hearing the voice of God for today, but also in determining things like who are the kinds of leaders who will best serve our communities and who will have that sense of responsibility to take us to the next step in our collective evolution. We need to harness our free will, therefore, to educate public opinion and our leaders about several things, about the consequences of our decisions. We saw this again with Brexit. Both parties, those who were for and against, fed the poor people of Britain so much misinformation that they were not able to make an informed decision. And they're now stuck with the consequences of their decisions, and there are so many consequences that nobody told them about and that they're now stunned by and are trying to figure out desperately how to deal with. I mean, the idea that they're trying to stock fresh foods in warehouses in England because there's likely to be massive interruptions in the flow of goods from the rest of the European Union to Britain is stunning. You can't keep fresh food in warehouses for very long. What are you going to do about component parts that are brought in every day across the borders? There are just so many things that they didn't consider, or that the vested interest didn't have an interest in letting people know about in advance, because they had ideological positions that they needed to maintain to keep themselves in power. We need to eliminate misinformation. One of the ways of doing it is not by giving equal weight and time to lies and evidence, truth and lies on a specific topic. This idea of having panels on television where you give 50% time to naysayers of climate change and 50% time to those who are in support of climate change is really idiotic, because it gives the impression that it's a 50-50% question, as opposed to looking at the science and the fact that 98% of scientists around the world are completely agreed that it is real and is caused by man-made actions, and that we need to take steps in the next decade to reverse things and avoid some of the worst consequences. There are some very interesting examples of how this public education can be carried out. I will just share one with you, and then we will move on to the last slide and then to your questions. In the run-up to the San Francisco conference in 1945 to bring about the United Nations and sign the charter, the U.S. government realized that they did not have the backing of the majority of the people in the United States, either for the creation of a United Nations or for the creation or the proposal of a standing force that could stop people like, maniacs like Hitler, stop them from destroying the peace of the world and committing acts of genocide like the Holocaust. And so the State Department of the US government engaged in a 6-month program that's really fascinating and that people don't talk about. They used many sources to educate the population about the dangers of not signing the charter, of not having a United Nations and not having an international standing force, and also educating them about the opportunities and the benefits, so the pros and the cons. They had articles published in magazines all around the country, especially a lot of women's magazines, so they're really going for the grassroots. They had radio broadcasts around the country. They approached academics and universities around the country and told them to talk about these things to their students. They talked to the heads of religious institutions and asked them to share this message from the pulpits and, from their churches and synagogues and so on. They asked Hollywood to come up with a documentary, and they really spared no resources. And what was fascinating was that after 6 months, they took another poll and they found that of the people who participated in it, 81% were in favor of the creation of the United Nations and in favor of the creation of a system of collective security and a standing force, which is absolutely stunning. What they were able to achieve in the course of 6 months just by setting an intention, creating a program of action, and following through on it. And it wasn't a question of propaganda. It was a question of really educating people and saying, okay, look, if we do this, here's some of the opportunities and the benefits. And if we don't do it, here, historically, we know is what's likely to happen again. We're likely to have a third world war. Here are the scenarios that are likely to occur, and we need an international organization that will ensure the peace of the planet. So that, to me, is a wonderful model and a very heartening example of the fact that such a thing is possible. All right, now once we have established the lesser peace, there is another step after that. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it today. I just wanted, for completeness sake, to have mentioned it. We remember that Baha'u'llah had told the rulers of the world that because ye have rejected the most great peace, hold fast to the lesser peace for now, so that you can ameliorate some of the conditions of your people and of yourselves. Well, the time will come when this amelioration will no longer be enough, when we will have to go beyond the lesser peace and create the most great peace. It will have taken a lot longer than what Baha'u'llah initially gave us the opportunity to do. The most great peace, the writings tell us, will involve the spiritualization of the world, will come about as a result of the spiritualization of the world. It will involve, the image that's given in the writings is, it will involve breathing life into a unified but lifeless body. It will deal with certain deep problems that society will continue to have even after the lesser peace, and that is particularly racism and the disunity between religions. So it will involve the fusion of all races, creeds, classes, nations, and will involve the union of people in one universal cause and one common faith. Ultimately, the most great peace will be based on the divinely appointed ordinances of Baha'u'llah implicit in his world order, and it will signalize the coming of age of the entire human race and will mark the last and highest stage in the stupendous evolution of man's collective life on this planet. This is the ultimate prize and the goal of Baha'u'llah's revelation. This is why we're here. This is why we now have our marching orders to go about and go out there in our individual lives, in our family lives, in our work lives, in our conversations and discourses with friends and family and colleagues, and create the soil first for the establishment of the lesser peace so that we can hasten the day when we will have won the ultimate prize of the most great peace, which can't happen before we have the lesser peace. I thank you for your attention. I thank you for having spent this time with me and have been willing for me to share my thoughts with you.
Thank you very much, Sovaida. That was a fascinating review of the Baha'i writings on the subject. I'm not sure I've ever seen the writings assembled in one place on the topic like this before. And I think that's, an enormous service to the Baha'i community, to be able to look at what Baha'u'llah, Abul-Baha, Shoghi Effendi, and the House of Justice have said about the processes the world is going through and the Baha'i community is going through, so that we can get that perspective. But then in addition to that, you've provided us with all of these tips, analogies, and other ideas for how the world can indeed get to its goal. So I think that's fantastic, and I thank you very much for that.
You're welcome.
Let me see what questions we have. We do have a few already, I'm glad to say. Let's see. Paul quotes the Persian hidden words, and then has a comment about it. Persian hidden words number 67. Know verily that while the radiant dawn breaketh above the horizon of eternal holiness, the satanic secrets and deeds done in the gloom of night shall be laid bare and manifest before the peoples of the world. And he talks about notes the Black Lives Matter campaign and the Me Too movement have been exposing the cover-ups of the police, of the violence against women, and of course now the cover-up of priests molesting children have also been exposed. So we seem to see exactly this process of the satanic secrets and deeds done in the gloom of night are being laid bare and manifest.
Thank you, Paul.
Yeah, that's his note, and I think that's an interesting example. Elham says, amazing presentation, Sovaida June. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and your examples were enlightening. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Elham Sayed. Perjaya says, wow, this is really great stuff. Thank you, thank you, thank you. So that's another very positive review. And I'm going on down through here. Of course, everybody always asks, was it recorded? And Cynthia would love to gather together some friends to watch this. Of course, we'll have it up on our website, our YouTube site, probably by tomorrow. And we will send the link out in our News at a Glance, which will go out Wednesday. But if you subscribe to our YouTube channel, you'll get a notice that the recording is available. So, Cynthia, you can always keep your eye out there. Ariane says, what transformations do you foresee in national governance while moving toward a world government? That's the question.
Okay. Well, the key transformation that I foresee, and it's going to take a while, is in the quality of leadership that we have. You know, there's, I'm reminded of a passage in Baha'u'llah's tablet to Queen Victoria, in which he addresses all the rulers of the world. So this is your leaders in national governance. And he tells them that when deliberating in their own parliaments and in Congress in the United States, what they should be thinking about is the good of humanity as opposed to the good of their country. Now, that is an amazing thing to have said in the 1860s, when we didn't have the kinds of global challenges that we have today. Imagine if the members of Congress of the United States or the members of Parliament in England were in their deliberations to think about the good of the world, to think, for instance, of climate change and how it's affecting people everywhere. Imagine if in our deliberations at the level of national governance, we had thought about the impact that the atrocities in Syria were having on the people there, and have done something and stepped in out of compassion, have created a global system that could deal with those problems, as opposed to being so short-sighted, thinking, oh, it's their problem, what is it to us? And having the fallout from the Syrian problem affect us. So the problems of migration, you look at the domino effect, the problems of migration in Europe caused primarily by the genocide in Syria and the atrocities, have been what have led to the xenophobia in Europe and to the rise of the populist regimes. So this change in outlook in the leadership, once that is done, everything else becomes possible. Then we can look with the eye of selflessness at, well, how well is our system working? So for example, in the United States, it's only when we get to the point that we have a group of leaders at all levels who are concerned with the good of the entirety of the nation, not just a particular group, and certainly not just one political party, but the good of the world, that we will do things like maybe even look at our Constitution and say, do we really need to all be carrying arms? Do these school shootings matter? There are so many things that will immediately be resolved when you have the right kind of leaders in place. So that's the biggest transformation that I see.
Very interesting, and I think that you made a very good point there about the need for that larger perspective, and that it can help reduce the xenophobia and the hate, is if people actually can accept this bigger umbrella of the earth is one country and mankind and citizens. And that's a huge educational task. Betty says, and this is a typical Betty comment, thank you for your interweaving of quotations from the Baha'i writings outlining the current processes that will lead to the lesser peace. Could you please provide page and paragraph references to the many quotations? And that, of course, really would help if we can stick up a PowerPoint which actually gives the sources. My
response is sure, but wow, you want me to do all the work for you guys. So my goal was to tease you so that you would go pull out the books and actually study them.
Where to look all the books and find them that way too, of course. If they know there's 2 in this book and there are 3 in that book, they'll know which ones to look where. Anyway.
I'm just joking.
Yes.
That was a tease.
Julie asks this interesting question. I recall but can't find at the moment message from the Universal House of Justice that the lesser peace had come. Are we just at the beginning stage? I don't recall such a message, but
there is no such message. What happened was that people took something that Abdu'l-Baha had said in the 20th century that and translated it to mean that the lesser peace would be established by the end of the 20th century. The House of Justice actually in this 2001 letter very clearly, it's a very long letter, and they explain in it that what Abdu'l-Baha was talking about was the unity of nations, which was one of the 7 candles of unity in his tablet, the candles of unity. And that the consciousness of world citizenship, which it really exists already in the world, many people are aware of it and talk about it, had already been firmly established by the end of the 20th century, and that was what Abdu'l-Baha was talking about, and it was not the lesser peace. And then they go on to say that the lesser peace is not an event, but it is a process, that it has already started. Indeed, the Guardian in World Order of Baha'u'llah says that the process of the most great peace, remember the most great peace is a longer process of which the lesser peace is the first part. He says the process of the most great peace had already started in the early part of the 20th century when Woodrow Wilson produced his 14 points. That's an amazing comment, right? And that's in World Order of Baha'u'llah. Again, you'll have to go look it up, but it's there. So there you have it. It is a process, and again, they say we don't know exactly when the process will come, but here are the tips. That's why I wanted to lay out for you, using the writings, what are the hallmarks and the features of the lesser peace, so that once we're there, we'll know we're there. Right. So as far as I'm concerned, none of this has happened. There's been no call to limit arms on an international basis by every country. There is no system of collective security. There is no world government. There has been no gathering of some of the leaders of the world as described by Abdu'l-Baha, whose only goal is to say, how are we going to achieve peace? None of these things has happened.
Right.
So we're not there yet. We're still in process. And it looks like we're in a period right now of setback, which the Guardian also describes and predicts will happen.
Right. And speaking of analogies, if you think about the enormous advance brought about by the United States Constitution to weld the 13 separate colonies together into a single nation, still didn't prevent the Civil War.
Correct.
There was still a Civil War.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And adding to that, the fires of the Civil War, the Guardian said, welded together the nation and took it to the next stage, to a federation. And he says that the same thing is going to happen at an international level, that the fires of suffering will weld together what's now, I guess, 193 nations into a world federation. And that's what it's going to take. So again, it's a very apt analogy, and the Guardian offers it as. And Abdu'l-Baha also, we should remember, told a high official in the US government in 1912 when he was traveling here that if he wanted to serve his country and the world, that the best way to do that was to export the principles of federalism upon which the US government was based. Now, doesn't mean the US government is perfect, which it's clearly not. It's the principles of federalism that underlie it that we should be focusing on, and that's what the world needs.
Right. Yeah, in fact, one of the interesting grammatical results of the Civil War, you might say, is that the term United States of America was a plural noun that took a plural verb. But after the war, it was a singular noun. The United States of America is. But before the Civil War, it was the United States of America are. Yeah. And we don't even think about grammatically what the war did to our understanding of what that word is. That's my understanding anyway. That's what I've heard. Some other comments here. Of course, we have 2 other people thanking you very much. As always, very eloquent and informative. Thank you for helping us to be positive in these turbulent times. That was by Farzad. Firuz Oskui adds, wish this talk reaches the ears of all politicians and legislators. And Juliana has another suggestion. Sovaida, have you ever thought of doing a tour of United States college campuses? So that's
I'd love to. If you'd like to help me, I'd love to. If you send me invitations, I'll come. Good. Really, it's getting this message out, whatever means we can use. But the media is really one of the best means. So if you guys take the link that Wilmette Institute provides you with and share it, put it on your Facebook pages, share it with people, put it on Twitter, put it in add it to your YouTube channels, whatever you need to do. I think it's an effective way. But if you invite me to come to a college campus, I will happily do so. I've done so before and happy to do more of it.
Very good. And I was very impressed. I don't think there was a single in your entire presentation. You were a very smooth presenter.
Oh, good to hear it. My barrister training from years ago is paying off.
Indeed, I'm sure that's true. Leslie says, thank you, Sovaida, for this very interesting and informative talk. I am taking the course on sustainable development, Wilmette Institute course, and the prosperity of humanity, sustainable development and the prosperity of humanity course right now, and your talk is an excellent resource for us. It was interesting to hear your assessment of the futility of spending valuable time and energy debating climate change. What other salient examples do you have of
what?
Of fruitless discussions, I believe.
Oh, well, let me put it this way. Again, in the spirit of saying what I was preaching, instead of thinking about what we shouldn't do, if we just focused on what we ought to do, and I think we provided a laundry list based on the writings and on the best science available today of what we should focus our energies on. I think if we do that, by definition, I guarantee we simply won't have time to do the rest.
That's a good Baha'i answer too, actually. Focus on the good points and not on the bad points. Nancy says, could you please give the Shoghi Effendi quote about one of the first things we should mention when we teach is global governance? Thank you. Wonderful presentation.
Yes, if I may, I don't have that in the papers at my desk right now, but it was in a letter written to a couple of individuals in the 1930s. And actually, I just sent it to somebody out in California who had asked me the same question. If you give me your email address, I'd be happy to email you. But yes, he says that in our teaching work, the first thing that we should talk about is the imminent need, the need for the creation imminently of a world superstate. It's the only way that it will solve the problems, and that it's predicated on the principle of the oneness of humanity. And then he also says, when one of the Baha'is said, well, should we be at the forefront of advocating for federation? He said, absolutely. Just because we don't get to bring about the lesser peace doesn't mean that the Baha'is shouldn't be at the forefront of disseminating the ideas. So, we tend to have this all or nothing approach. Well, if I can't bring this about, then I'm just going to sit back and wait. And, what have I got to do? I feel, again, it's that victim modality that we're in. Oh, I'm victim, I'm helpless, and therefore I can't do anything, and therefore I won't do anything. No, we can start sharing these ideas, and ideas are viral, and they have a tipping point. You don't have to have the majority of people hearing about the idea. It's just a critical % of the population needs to hear it and accept it, and then it will enter into social discourse, and before you know it, our leaders will be talking about it too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we see that on other topics too. We see topics that at first no one wants to talk about, and then a few people begin to talk about it, and the next thing you know, it's sort of on everyone's lips. And it is indeed possible, especially when we face collective crises. When we face collective crises, people are going to realize you have to have a collective solution, and climate change is certainly one of the obvious examples of that. Ariane Sabet says, thank you, Sovaida, and greetings from Italy.
Oh, Ariane, lots of love to you.
Leslie says, I look forward to reading your book. Where is it available? Amazon?
Amazon. Yeah. All the books are available on Amazon.
Yeah.
And you can also go to my website, and there's a link there. You can go from there, or you can just go straight to Amazon.
And we've got, 3 books? We're talking about 3 books by you now, right? That are on Amazon?
They're all 3. Collective Security Within Reach was the first one. You can also get that from George Ronald directly or Baha'i Distribution Service. The second one was Building a World Federation, the Key to Resolving Our Global Crises. I'm happy to say it's now being carried by the Baha'i Distribution Service here in this country as well. And you get it on Amazon. And Bridge to Global Governance, which focuses on tackling climate change, energy distribution, and nuclear proliferation, is also available on Amazon, and the Baha'i Distribution Service is carrying it too, so you can get them. And they're all available as e-readers as well. And for those of you who speak Farsi or have Iranian friends, all are available as downloads in Farsi on my website, because I wanted people to have access to that. So.
And we should also add that the second book is one of the bases for a course that you teach for the Wilmette Institute every year, generally sometime in the summer, Building the World Federation. And that course was very successful this year and is coming back around next, I think we've said June of next year, if I remember right.
Yes.
John says, what role do you see for raising global public awareness on the need to balance the human population to the capacity of the planet?
Okay, so again, you see, now we're getting into nitty-gritty of policy making in different areas. The only way any and all of these problems are going to be resolved is by electing the kinds of leaders who are aware that this is a global challenge, that we are using up our resources faster than we can replace them, that we're denuding the planet, and that they have to, through an act of consultative will, as the House of Justice said in the peace statement, come up with the solutions. But they will have to, so first we have to have the right kind of leaders, number one, which is what we've been talking about. The second thing is that the collective, these leaders need to get together and identify and agree upon a set of organizing principles. And then the next step is to apply those principles methodically to solve problems, including the global population problem. That's one of a litany of problems. So we're not in the business here as Baha'is really of saying, well, here is this one problem and this is what we need to do. All of these problems are systemic ones. They're all collective, many of them, and we need to have the right kinds of leaders and the right methodology in place to tackle them, including the correct global international institution.
Julie has this fairly lengthy comment. Part of the loss of hope for me is the responsibility and challenge faced by Baha'is to ameliorate the suffering of humanity. I find myself exhausted by this because for years I have redoubled my efforts to serve, tried to engage my community, both Baha'i and the greater community, in dialogue, devotion, study circles, etc. Unfortunately, there has been no response. I am deeply discouraged. I'm only responsible for my own efforts, but am horrified at the exhaustion and subsequent apathy that exists in my small community. How do we move forward in the face of this? You talked about this, of course.
Okay, so Julie, my heart goes out to you, first of all. Take care of yourself. You know, let's make it really simple. So sometimes it's hard to drag a community along with one, so let's just focus on ourselves. It sounds like you've been trying individually also to engage in a lot of activities. My own experience is just very personal, is that I am most successful when I do things that bring me joy. So I have found, for example, that gathering people together in my home to share music, art, poetry, and then talk about a theme that is of interest to people. So when there are gun shootings, we say, gosh, people are going to come because everybody's bursting to talk about it. And then we can say, well, hey guys, we've seen a lot of this. Are there some principles that we can identify that might help us to move to the next stage? What is it that we're lacking? Just throw some questions out there. What do you think we're lacking? Is it the kind of leaders? Well, what should we be looking for in our leaders? What qualities? We don't need to make it difficult. We don't need to make it, we've gotten caught in this rigid way of thinking that I have to do X number of devotionals, X number of study circles, and so on. And it's not yielding the results we want in this country, from what I hear from reports from National Convention last year. So we need to do things differently. Just invite friends over who like you, whom you like, get together and talk about things that are of concern to all of them, and serve them some nice tea and cookies, and you'll be amazed at how interested they'll be if they're not invited to a devotional, which immediately has a religious connotation, or a study circle. And secondly, how energized you'll be as a result of this interaction. You'll have 100-fold energy to have 10 of these conversations. It can be at Starbucks over a cup of coffee. It can be in your home. It could be at the swimming pool. Again, we need to start getting really creative. We just need to elevate the level of discourse, and it should be like breathing air. It should, if it's depleting us, we're doing something wrong, is my humble opinion. So.
Very good. And Mary Kay asks whether this is all going to be part of the recording. And yes, normally the question and answer session is indeed part of the recording, so it should be available as well. That runs out of these questions, and maybe we'll have a few more that will pop in.
I got 2 comments here from social media, which are kind of good.
Oh, Boyd, yes, pass those on to us, and maybe Sovaida can answer them.
I'll do it right now because I can't copy and paste it at the moment. Karen says today's New York Times Magazine, 10/14/18, page 8, has a survey. Will we ever attain peace on Earth? Results: yes, 6%, no, 61%, maybe 33%. Any comment?
Yeah, remember what I said about the United States State Department carrying out, they had similar polls when they started before they started their 6-month, we're not talking about 1 year, 5 years, 10 years. Their 6-month intense efforts to raise people's consciousness. That's what's required. That's why we're having this conversation today, to give you the tools that you need so that when you go out into the world and have these conversations, you can help raise the consciousness and maybe shift the energy and perception of some of your friends, and they in turn will go out and do the same, and so on and so forth. If each of us did that, over time we would see the kind of shift that we saw with the experiment at the State Department. So yes, that was why I had this talk, because one sees the apathy, frankly, not just in the outside community, but within the Baha'i community. We need to constantly be deepening ourselves in the writings, because when we don't, then we get prone to the same negative feelings, the fears, the doubts, the concerns, the despondency, the depression, and we cannot afford it.
One more here from Sue. She asks, how do we respond to people who confuse the world order of Baha'u'llah and the coming World Federation with the, quote, New World Order, end quote?
The New World Order as...
Maybe the helicopters, New World Order of the
oh, I see.
nearest side of things.
I've got it. Okay.
Yes. Yes.
You mean the New World Order is described in the outside society? Okay, that's a really good question. So here's where we have to get very familiar with the details of what Baha'u'llah's divine program says this world order consists of. So for example, a lot of people are fearful when they think of the idea of a world government or world federation, because they think, oh my gosh, what if we get an oppressive regime that is now going to be global in nature and do bad things to us? Well, because what they're doing is taking regimes that exist right now, regimes of strongmen, of based on, you know, I don't want to name nations, and importing them and saying, okay, if we project forward at an international level, if we had such a thing, how horrible would it be? And they're absolutely right. But Baha'u'llah's system, it guarantees, first of all, it builds into the very structure of institutions like this. Let's just take one for ease of analysis, a world parliament. A world parliament is not one guy or one nation telling other nations what to do. Members of the parliament are elected by all the peoples of the world. That means that all voices everywhere, all races, all ethnic groups, all peoples, all nations are going to be heard and will be adequately represented. The voting will be such that it's fair. We won't have veto power like we do in the Security Council of the United Nations. Again, there are inbuilt guarantees to ensure that voices are heard, that diversity is maintained and celebrated, that voting is fair, that decisions are applied and laws even-handedly, which they're not in today's world with the current system we have in place. So it would take me a few hours to unpack for you what all the elements that exist in Baha'u'llah's divine program. This is really the entirety of his revelations in world order that ensure that we won't have a problem of the kind that people are afraid of. So the short answer is, it needs time. You need to say to that person, okay, we need to sit down, let's have coffee. It may not be just one coffee session, maybe 3 or 4, and I will share with you all the safeguards and guarantees. And look, this is so exciting. But it also means that you first have to educate yourself about what the writings say so that you feel equipped to do it. And I hope that actually the book Building a World Federation addresses some of these questions head on. It's short, it's an easy read, and I offer it as an easy way to get into the topic.
Good. We have a couple of more comments now. Bonnie notes how hard it is for small local events to matter as opposed to large government or public things in the large government sphere or the public sphere. And I think that's just a comment. Paul also notes that, well, we're speaking of climate change. There's a new biography of Sir Richard St. Barbe Baker that's come out, The Man of the Trees, the first global conservationist. And I should add that at the Parliament of Religions in Toronto in early November, there's going to be an event about the book, and the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario Province, who is appointed by Queen Elizabeth II as her representative in Ontario, is actually sponsoring a reception for the book, including the author Paul Hanley. So that's quite nice. John Dale has a question, and I think this will probably be our last question. Bonnie says Bonnie says she's asked a question here. Hard to understand how small local events matter as opposed to large government or public spheres. And I guess the question is, how do you see small local events as mattering in bringing about this kind of change in the world?
Everything matters, because ultimately global society is made up of a whole bunch of small groups of people in their localities. So if you can get 5 people to come to a local event and you can help them shift their consciousness and their energy and their mindset, you will have done well. If all of us in all our localities did that, we would be golden. So again, don't diminish the value of doing things at the grassroots, which again, the House of Justice is training us in the importance of this with the Institute process, right? All our activities are not, I mean, really down to the neighborhood now. Even the clusters were broken up into smaller components. So this is all part of the great laboratory of governance that the Baha'i administrative order is, because we know it's the nucleus and pattern for the future world order writ large for the entire world. So yeah, it's fine. You're doing well. Not everybody needs to hear about it. Just the few people who attend are perfect.
That's good. John's question, or commented question, Costa Rica in 1984 proposed a mechanism of global advisory referendums on basic global public issues like nuclear disarmament. And do you have any comments about that proposal?
I'm not intimately familiar with the proposal in particular, but I do have views on referenda. From everything I have read, and there are a lot of really interesting studies done on referenda, it's a very poor way to get us anywhere, because you have to frame questions very narrowly. You lose a lot of the nuances, and you misread people's responses, thinking that by saying yes to something or no to something, they meant, we extrapolate a whole bunch of assumptions again that are false. And so just generally utilizing referenda as a tool, I wouldn't encourage it. There are better ways of raising consciousness and moving the ball forward.
They probably also encourage a lot of targeted marketing or advertising, pro or against, where, I mean, Brexit is probably the best example of all that, actually, with all of the misinformation.
I'll end with this comment. You know, the Prime Minister of Luxembourg at the time, Jean-Paul Juncker, said something really interesting when we were in the heat of the financial crisis that started in 2008 in Europe. He said, look, it's not that we, the leaders, don't know what to do. We do know what to do. Our problem is we don't know how to get reelected once we've done the right thing. So the leaders don't need referenda to tell them what they need to do. We need leaders who have, as Abdu'l-Baha said, have sincere intentions, who are willing to put aside their self-interest, including the interest of getting reelected, in order to do what's right for their communities, to have the courage of character to do it, and to be willing to self-sacrifice in order to get us all to the right place. That is going to be the key. They don't need referenda for people to tell them, oh yeah, we think you should do X or Y. Besides, again, if we look at the model of the Baha'i administrative order, once we elect our institutions, and there's a democratic process in which everyone gets to participate, but that's where the democratic process ends. Once the institutions have been elected, they're not answerable to the community. They don't go with the whims of the community. Sure, they get suggestions and recommendations at feast, but they're not at all bound by those suggestions and recommendations. Right. They are answerable only to their own conscience and to God, and to the process of consultation that's confidential. So this is where we need to get the world. If we're truly to be the nucleus and pattern for New World Order, we need to start importing some of these ideas and principles into the way we do business in the global arena.
Yeah, we think about the turbulence the Greek government faced during the mess over the Greek debt and all of the need for cutting the budget, and how many times did the Greeks get different prime ministers in that period of time because of the huge difficulty that whoever they elected or chose as prime minister was going to have to make some very difficult decisions. And hey, they went through, I think, 3 prime ministers in a matter of 6 months as a result of that, that mess, you know. I think that's pretty much the end of the questions, so I should probably, our audience is shrinking, so I should probably very quickly move on and talk about a few other things for people to be aware of. Thank you again, Sovaida. This has been really a marvelous session this afternoon, and I think this is going to be quite memorable for some time.
Thank you. My pleasure, and thank you very much.